And again, I want to welcome Eric Cohen, XBRL Global Technical Leader at PwC, who is joining us here today and going to walk us through the EDGAR Filer Manual. Eric?
Thank you, Michelle. And can I confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Come through loud and clear. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, great. So thank you, everybody, for joining me today for 5 years of XBRL in the EDGAR Filer Manual, or 50 EDGAR Filer Manual rules in 50 minutes, whichever you'd prefer. Now, some of you may be old pros at this whole XBRL preparation thing, while others may be new, perhaps new to their position, or maybe even considering XBRL for the very first time. Perhaps your company is one of those potential IFRS filers that might be starting XBRL in the not-too-distant future. One way or the other, starting with this overview, we're going to lead into a background on the EDGAR Filer Manual and the EDGAR system it supports. I'll give you a guide to some of the basic design principles of the EFM, and I'll identify some key terms that will guide your primary tasks, in particular how to create that extension, company extension, taxonomy, and the instance. Throughout, I'll be giving you some tips and tricks and share some up-to-date news on this ever-evolving world of the EDGAR Filer Manual. So what is EDGAR, the thing that requires the filing manual? Well, the EDGAR is the SEC system for electronically filing with the SEC, for performing automated collection, validation, indexing, acceptance, and forwarding of submissions by companies and other entities who are required by law to file forms, exhibits, correspondence, and other documents electronically. EDGAR is then used by analysts, investors, the press, and other stakeholders to research information on those public companies. EDGAR is ever evolving. As a matter of fact, sort of hot off the press is the recently published draft strategic plan of the SEC, where they noted that sometime between 2014 and 2018, we're going to see new filings structured for automated data retrieval and analysis that are going to replace all filings submitted through the EDGAR system today. So we've got this wonderful thing, ever-changing, and with some wonderful changes upcoming. Today, if you want to go and find these filings that the EDGAR Filer Manual helps oversee, we've got a bunch of ways to do that. You can go to the SEC's website, and it has quite a few different entry points for searching EDGAR by a variety of different organizational identifiers, the CIK, perhaps a ticker symbol, or the company's name, organization's name. Now, along with going there and picking them up one at a time, some information consumers download information from EDGAR in bulk, and have been doing this for some time. More recently, the SEC began providing something called RSS feeds, and through these feeds, you can even automate information coming to you in near real time, hot off the press. If you've gone to look at those filings one at a time, you probably saw something like this. This is what an individual company filing looks like on EDGAR. When it includes interactive data, and that lower section that's highlighted provides links to the XBRL submissions. Now, of course, this is the EDGAR Filer Manual, and the EFM, by the way, does include guidance related to a bunch of the stuff that you see down there. The exhibit number, the file names, and how they're designed, the required and optional files, and more. So let's turn our focus from EDGAR to that document of the day, the EDGAR Filer Manual, as you've already heard me refer to it, the EFM. Now, as we speak, this being the 12th of February, the current adopted version is version 25. Now, EDGAR is supposed to be going through an update next week on the 18th, and that will be the time when 26 is supposed to be ushered in. I'll be talking a little bit more about this process, and the SEC has already alluded to version 27, but said you don't have to worry about that for at least a month or so, not before March 18th. Now, as the rules for all electronic submission to EDGAR, the 550 exciting pages or so of the EFM include technical information on many aspects of submitting and tracking submissions to EDGAR. Now, Chapter 5 and 6 are both really relevant here, but Chapter 6 in particular holds the 220 or so numbered sections that introduce the specific requirements for creating those XBRL or interactive data filings. Now, Chapter 6 does have less than 60 pages, so I encourage everybody who's listening to this webcast that has an interest to go ahead and read through Chapter 6 on your own, in addition to listening to the session, but don't do it, as a warning, just before you operate heavy machinery. Don't worry if you don't understand it all. Much of it is very technical in nature. But just as Mark Twain is quoted as saying, it ain't those parts of the Bible that I don't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I do understand. The same is probably relevant to the EDGAR filer manual. As you read through it, you're going to see this little dichotomy, and down below a little snippet that talks about the content of definition link bases and the syntax of reference link bases. Chapter 6 is structured around these two terms, the syntax and the content. They divide into two the types of rules that you're going to find laid out in the EDGAR manual. Now, syntax is the more technical side of the picture, reflecting the, if you will, technical grammatical rules for constructing the files. The rules, the limitations, the order and relationships between the pieces of things that are XBRL. Now, syntax provides more consistency related to the technology, whereas content is consistency about the business meaning. Content covers the rules that define knowledge side of the picture. In the case of XBRL, the business reporting specifics. Syntax may do something like limit the number of characters you can put in a readable label. Content is going to deal with issues such as whether you have classes of stock or how your corporate structure is set up or whether you have some specific reporting scenarios. So two very different things. On the left there you can see the high-level review of the Chapter 6. And you can see a flow from the submission and filing as a whole, and then into the instance documents, and then off into the company extension schemas, and the link bases both severally and individually. Then you might notice, again, this syntax and contents and how these headers alternate. And over on the right, you can see 6.6, which is the content of instances. So the content rules require at least broad financial reporting knowledge, if not very specific knowledge of the company's reporting environment. The content rules, as I mentioned earlier, involve the business side of the filing, and therefore they're going to require the filer's own knowledge of their financials to be followed correctly. The corporate structure and stock that I mentioned before, that's EFM 6.6.3 through 6.6.10, for those of you who are keeping score at home. This need for human judgment means a large proportion of content rules will not be able to be automated and will need your personal attention. So the content requires personal attention a large portion of the time, but that other side, the automatable side, mostly the sync side, well, let's just look at one of these in particular, 6.5.8. It says that every context has to be used at least by one line item in this document. So no unused context. Now, that's something that software can check automatically. You don't need specific knowledge of your business to know whether or not every context has been used. And so most preparation software, most review software is going to help you avoid getting into these errors, or at least identify if you've somehow violated one of these automatably checked or run rules. Now, software can provide wizards to help in the cases where you don't necessarily need a lot of specific business acumen. So if you enter the company CIK or the symbol once somewhere, the software can take care of it from there and use them for contexts and file names and all the behind-the-scenes identifiers and a bunch of other places. So 6.5 is the syntax section. Sometimes we have a little blend. Here 6.5.2 says your identifier must have the CIK or the registrant as its content. So this you need to at least know the company's CIK, and we blend these in. The software can at least help you get these things more correct. So most of these syntax rules can be driven and checked in a purely automated fashion, and that leaves only a smaller percentage that requires judgment of some kind. And the proportion is flipped when you talk about the content ones, which require more of that human judgment or interaction. Now, most of the tools and services that are available in the market today for XBRL creation and checking, they include rules that check the instance document complies with the automatable portions of the EDGAR Filer Manual. Some come with guidance from the SEC's own Interactive Data Public Test Suite, and some come with their own interpretations of that aren't provided by the SEC. This kind of checking, called SEC EDGAR or EDGAR Filer Manual validation, helps you as an essential step to make sure that as many rules as possible are checked and that the quality is as good as it can be. Now, passing the SEC's own validation in a test submission doesn't mean that you are EFM EDGAR error-free, but it means that you're through the door. They only test a subset of the written requirements, both automatable and otherwise. Now, as technical as the EFM is, management is still responsible for everything that's there. They're not able to delegate the responsibility, say, to a third party. But for those sections of the EFM that are noted as syntax, it's understood that business people are going to be relying more on their software developer or service provider for compliance with the SEC's requirement, and that they'll follow the EDGAR Filer Manual's own advice to perform those missions with sufficient time to act on any errors and interpret any warnings before the required due date of the filing. So let's talk about patterns. We've mentioned the syntax and content. We've mentioned the flow from instance document through company extension. The major sections of the EFM were laid out in that outline that I showed you. But now let's look at the individual numbered sections. Let's look at a couple to identify some common patterns, and I've got here on the screen 6612 about tagging the face fund name, 6635 related to units of measure. Now, what you can see in both cases is that there's a number followed by some bold text, and then that's followed by some lighter explanatory materials and examples. The bold headers generally contain the rules, the things that you have to follow, but you do need to read that explanatory text as well for additional, perhaps related rules. Now, in the case of 6612 there in the upper right, it's pretty simple. You've got the rules about tagging the facts found in the header. You've got some simple examples found below. And this section is just fleshing out the statement in Rule 33-9002 about a complete set of information for all periods required to be presented in the corresponding data in the related official filing, no more and no less. But in contrast, let's look at that 635. And it begins with a limitation on units of 10 units of measure. So don't, for example, have blocks for individual blocks and then create blocks for thousands of blocks and mega blocks for millions of blocks in one instance. Just choose one and then express everything. But then it goes on there in the lower right with additional guidance on creating consistent units of measure both within a document and in future documents. And then it goes on to define how to create custom units of measure, both of those things being related to but not explaining the content that was in bold. So to review, the primary rules are listed in the bold text at the beginning of each section. The bold text is followed by additional explanatory information. Now, that bold text usually uses precise technical terms. The explanatory text is made to clarify those rules and typically includes examples. The bold text will have some rule. It'll probably use words like must and should, either explicitly or implicitly. Now, you'll find the headers listed in the table of contents at the beginning of the EFM. But again, to find things that are perhaps more relevant or understandable, you'll have to be searching through the explanatory text. Now, some of the section headings are foundational rules. We talked about 6612. Lots of sections are based on this one. Instances have to have facts for each combination of line item and period in the HTML. And so the items that follow, 6613 and forward, are going to be helping explain that a little bit more. This one is very foundational. So rules, explanations, examples, this is our primary pattern for those numbered sections, but there are still some exceptions. Some of these aren't rules at all. They just provide context, define terms within the scope of the EDGAR Filer Manual, or provide other guidance. Here's 664, and it says if you've got facts about a consolidated entity and one or more of its subsidiaries and they have reporting obligations, well, this is something called a consolidating instance. So there's no rule. It's establishing a definition that's used in later sections. Likewise, 637, XBRL document names are case sensitive, and validation requires instances, link bases, and schemas to refer to each other using URIs, which are case sensitive. So nothing that you have to act on per se. If you are used to Unix, you know that your file names are case sensitive. If you're used to DOS and Windows, they don't care. But what is this? This is some guidance. It's a help. Even though it's numbered, even though it has bold stuff, it is not something that is going to impact our any business thoughts about our filing. So an example of a place where those rules are embedded in the explanatory text might be the one on the screen here, 666. This is about block text tagging, level 1 tagging of notes. Talked about doing that for each note, each required schedule. But then as you dig down a little bit, it goes on to talk about the need to preserve the formatting using escaped HTML. It says your entire text must contain only well-formed HTML. Again, none of this necessarily directly related to the need to take each major note and put that into a single tag. Now, one of my favorites is EDGAR Filer Manual 6.7.12 of the 50 or so, 55 pages of the Chapter 6. This one rule takes up 2 solid pages of it, so it's a good one. I keep this one by the bedside when I have difficulty going to sleep. And it establishes the outline structure that viewers of the rendered document need to navigate in order to find specific content. Now, the bold text lays out the general guidance for establishing the presentation group, but as you read on through the 2 pages, you're going to find many more requirements and details. All right, so we've talked about the structure, we've talked about the content versus the syntax, talked about the basic data flow. We've talked about the headings, the numbers. We've talked about you interpret and you find things around. So that's the general outline and pattern. You may now wonder how the EFM is updated. Well, the SEC updates the EFM on a regular basis. It's necessarily every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months. It's when it needs updating. Whenever there's planned changes to the EDGAR system, when there's changes to the SEC's implementation, when there are errors that need to be corrected, and when there's situations the SEC sees need to be clarified. Now, before they update the EFM officially, they will take a red line planned update document. They'll post that up to their website. It's normally at a link that looks like that second bullet where you replace the NN with the next version. So currently, if you wanted to find version 26, you can find that off of xbrl.sec.gov or by going to replace NN with 26. When they post 27, unless they do some major change since they've begun, you'll see that, except there'll be 27 where the NN is _D for the draft. The document has within those red line text a summary of the changes broadly to EDGAR and specifically to the XBRL section, and also a project date when they think the document will be finalized. On or about that date, the SEC is going to publish an updated version of the EFM. Now, we're currently sitting on 25 being the approved version. There is a 26 draft out there. It's available off of draft from xbrl.sec.gov. In that document, it had said that they had planned to update things last week. Off those pages now, you can see they plan to do it next week. The SEC has also mentioned in an email about some changes to their test, the not yet available V27, that they're going to be removing certain restrictions for date ranges and context, in particular a one-day context, but that you're not going to have to worry about that before March 18th. They've also mentioned in that email that they're going to be deprecating 2012 US GAAP taxonomy, and that sometime on or after March 18th we'll begin support for the 2014 taxonomies. You'll see a final rule. You will see it show up in the Federal Register, but normally you'll see all this happen once the EDGAR system updates based on the red line that's out. Now, the SEC does provide additional guidance. For a number of years, they were looking at the filings for the first couple of years. They were finding things that they thought might be, need some additional guidance, and so those topics are covered in the guidance documents you see on the screen, where filers had the most questions or problems. And in most of the cases, you'll see them map right into key EDGAR filer manual sections that we're doing. Again, this available from xbrl.sec.gov under Staff Observations. You'll also see interpretations and frequently asked questions meant to help clarify common misperceptions of the goals and requirements of the EDGAR filer manual, as well as to provide other technical guidance filing, the SEC's previewer, and the viewer, again, available from xbrl.sec.gov. Now, the fine folks who are sponsoring this, XBRL US, also have brought together a crack team to resolve some non-authoritative but collaboratively developed best practices. XBRL US established this group comprised of a wide variety of stakeholders, and on the Working Groups page available from xbrl.us, you'll see the periodic resolutions as they come to be agreed upon, as well as the top document which brings them together into one document. And again, very helpful guidance. You have additional on top of the EFM. All right, so we've talked about the basic structure of the document. We've talked about it being updated. Let's now go through a whole bunch of sections, and we'll map them to your typical process flow. Again, there's no short quiz next period, so don't worry about that. But hopefully some of the major sections will be helpful as you look at the tasks you're doing, and they'll point you to some of the key EFM sections that may be relevant to you. Michelle, I am just going to come up for a breath real quick here and ask if there's anything that we need to stop for.
Thanks. I don't think we have any questions at this time. So,
Right.
you know, I imagine you can continue.
All right.
Okay, but just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, you can send questions through the moderated chat in the lower right-hand corner of your screen.
Thank you, Michelle. So, as we move on, let's our attention first to the process flow for the steps in building the company's extension taxonomy and the key relevant EDGAR filer manual sections, and then we'll move on to the instance document counterpart. So as you consider creating your company's extension taxonomy, some typical steps are, number one, figure what it is that you're going to have to tag, and then create some sort of a mapping, a conceptual mapping between the facts in your report to the US GAAP taxonomy. Considering, of course, the impact of dimensions as you're doing it, as the US GAAP taxonomy and the filings are not simple line items and one-dimensional. Going on to create the relationship groupings, as we spoke about in 6.7.12, that outline that if someone goes to the rendering tool, to the viewer, and they bring up your filing, you can see the income statement and the balance sheet and all the different things laid out, and helps you navigate. Based on things that you might be missing in your mapping, you go ahead and create some extension elements. Once all the pieces are there, you create your presentation relationships to match the order and indentation of your paper as you can. You create labels to match the captions and some other rules. You create your calculation relationships. You create your definition relationships. And by that time, you have a company extension taxonomy. Let's dig into that a little bit. So step one, let's map to the base taxonomy. And so that's what our first step is going to be, is by identifying what needs to be tagged so that we can see if what we need is in the taxonomy. As we saw before, 6.6 is largely about instances, but it also is going to help drive our taxonomy, and 6.6.12 and following provides guidance on the set that requires tagging, but also tells you what should not be tagged. The sections discuss the numbers found in columns, the numbers found in caption, text, in the words over on the left there, things like the number of shares authorized, issued, and outstanding, or the amount of allowance for bad debts. And it talks about the 4 different aspects of the notes to the financial statement, the level 1, 2, 3, 4 from the notes, and level 1 and 2 from your required supplemental schedules. A key section in EDGAR Filing Manual 6.6.22, that's the one that requires all monetary values, all percentages, and all the numbers in each of the notes to the financial statement to be tagged. Step 1 also calls for identifying base taxonomy elements and determining if the extension should be created. And 6.6.24 through 29 provide guidance on ways to use the definitions, the human readable documentation, the references, things from the FASB codification, and other attributes to best determine the best possible element to choose for the values in the HTML version of file. So 6.6.29 provides a specific set of things in the taxonomy considered authoritative for picking your matches. And other than these things, everything else, such as the element's name, the thing that goes inside the angle brackets, if you will, or the accounting balance, which as you can see there, we're going to point to 6.6.30, which says that you don't include the balance in your decision-making process, or places in the presentation calculation link base. Those things are all useful, but those don't have the authority of the 5 things that are laid out in this section. Now, coincidentally, EFM 6.6.29 is a nice summary of the immediately preceding sections. Of those 5 mentioned, the first one to consider is the period type, and that's described in 6.6.23. Next, you go to the data type, and that's explained in 6.6.27. The documentation labels is the third item. That's referenced in the EFM sections 24, 25, and 26. The standard label, it doesn't have any explicit guidance associated with it, but the 5th factor, the authoritative reference, that's got guidance provided in 6.6.28. So a nice little guide. These are the items that help you pick the right things. Now, if you're not sure about when or how to add the new elements, 6.8 provides the recommendations. Now, you're probably aware that the SEC always says that people are adding new elements all the time when they shouldn't, so you may want to ask the person who sits next to you at work to tattoo key sections of 6.8 on their back for you. Step 2, mention the dimensions. And in Step 2 of the company extension taxonomy process, you need to determine if dimensions are needed and how to structure them, as you would with this table. It shows dimensions on how to describe fact values, such as financing, division, revenues, in various regions. Now, the definition link base is the place where this goes, and so it's really helpful when you're defining the required axes, in particular related to legal entities, classes of stock, and reporting scenarios, which I've raised before. Now, this is covered, these particular areas are covered in EFM Rule 6.6.3 through 11 and 6.8.20, and they address how to create extension axes and access. Now, the FAQs provide a lot of additional clarification to the EFM on when to use the existing structures in the US GAAP taxonomy and when it's better or when you should roll your own instead. Now, Michelle, just so you know, as you move your mouse around, I can see your name flying around the screen. Just so you know. Now, regarding domain members, guidance provided in EFM 6.8.18 through 6.8.21. 6.8.18, if there's no standard taxonomy schema that has domain member elements specific to distinguish between your facts, go ahead and create them, but don't create a total. Just use the item without it. The EFM specifically addresses that you should not create members to represent totals. Just use the default value of the line item instead. The third step is creating those relationships that need to be included in your filing. We've already mentioned my favorite section, 6.7.12, and so it and other sections lay out all the different things you need so that things sort in the right order and discuss the right type of reporting so we can make sure the right information is in the right place and the description so it matches what you find in your reports. and also has something like role URI, a Uniform Resource Identifier. It's a techie thing that looks a lot like a web address, but it isn't, that helps you unambiguously find certain things. And again, you can see there M679 through 15, 613.4 on top with the 6.7.12 centered in the middle of it all. So, having now mentioned many times the expansive 6.7.12 about presentation groups, you might guess that there'd be additional guidance in the EDGAR Filer Manual as well for other things about how we build these relationship groups, how we identify them. Building these also has a lot to do with some other uses, these technical things in the background. EFM 679 related to the relationship group, 6.7.13 about some other things, provides various uses of these URIs. 6.7.11 discusses which link bases will apply to the relationship groups. And EFM 6.13.4 maintains that the parenthetical relationship groups discusses those and says something that a lot of people don't know about, speaks about having a header up at the top of your financials and other documents. And it says that if you've got a parenthetical group, so the balance sheet's got the things like the stock authorized, issued, outstanding, or the allowance for doubtful accounts, and others have these parentheticals, it says that you should have an abstract header, and it will normally be the same abstract header you use at the top of the base statement. So a lot of people don't know that one, according to some recent statistics where someone found only 27 cases out of thousands recently where that was done. So we move on, step 4, and that's about creating extensions. We're going to be creating the extension elements, and that's going to require creating appropriate names and the related attributes, things like the balance attribute, the period type, whether it's an abstract, the data types. And this guidance is all bundled up in section 6.8. There's specific guidance related to naming, for assigning the attributes for the new concepts. And the guidance has, especially for monetary items, is laid out there. For example, do you need a balance attribute? Well, 6.8.11 says if it's a monetary, then you're going to need a balance attribute if it is a balance sheet or increment item. We're going to see a little bit later when we get to labels, if you've got a monetary without a balance attribute, then you're going to have to set up a documentation label that will disambiguate the sign. Disambiguate, one of my favorite words. Step 5 in our process is to define the presentation groups, the ones that follow the order and the indentation of the disclosures that are represented in the printed filing as possible. The rules related to the presentation relationships can be found in EFM 6.8.8 and in sections 6.13.1, 2, and 3. Now, everything needs to be presented somewhere. If you put a number or a fact in your instance document, it's got to be in a presentation link base. It's got to show up somewhere. And as possible, that presentation relationship should follow the order and the indentation of the facts in the document of record. Now, there are common transposition issues because the tables in print may not be structured the same way that it will naturally flow out from the tables as designed in the US GAAP taxonomy. That can't be avoided. The SEC has noted that you shouldn't compromise your data quality to get the presentation to match up with the paper. So I brought up the topic of labels. Labels are our step 6. That's where we take all the captions from our report and we make sure that they're captured, and the presentation is going to put them in the right place using a preferred label. So let's talk through those resources for creating the labels. 6.11 1 through 4 and 6.11 6 through 9 are going to cover many label-specific topics, including matching labels to the printed document captions, making sure that they are both in the label link base and using the preferred label that they show up in the right place to match presentation. Talks about using suffixes in labels where necessary to clarify the meaning of the data type of elements. The use of special types of labels, total labels, beginning and ending or roll forward labels, negated labels, and when you've got more than one type of caption for the same fact in other places, taking advantage of some of the other standard rules with names like terse and verbose. Now, we spoke about that balance attribute before. EFM 611.5 says that monetary values that don't have a balance attribute need a documentation label to disambiguate the sign. I think Jeff Foxworthy uses the word in some of his routines. Negated labels from 611.6, if you're not aware, are a special class of labels that let you match up appropriately the number in the instance document as positive or negative based on the balance attribute in the taxonomy. But then when you go to print it, if it's printing the wrong way compared to your paper, you can reverse the sign, make something that looks positive become negative, make something that looks negative look positive instead, by using a negated label instead of a standard label in that place in the presentation. Again, using the preferred label. Now, if you're using captions in a language other than US English, perhaps you're one of those IFRS filers soon to file, you may want to make sure that you read through EFM syntax section 610 1 through 3 to ensure that your captions are also expressed in US English.
Eric, we have a question, if I could jump in for a minute here.
Yes, please.
The question is, how frequently is the EDGAR Filer Manual revised, and how can people stay abreast of changes that the SEC is making in the Filer Manual that will affect their process?
Well, that is the question that I wish I had a better answer for. Just to take you through the first 10 or so versions, you could see that we started off every 3 or 4 months. It got a little bit longer after that. As they're going through some major changes, they may speed it up. So they change it as they have the need, as the EDGAR system needs updating, as they find major clarification. How can you keep track of when it gets updated? There's any number of tools that you can be using, the tools they use for search engine optimization that let you know when web pages change, that you can have looking at the SEC site. The SEC also lets you sign up for notification as their pages change. If you're a true obsessive, then you can, on some regular basis, just put into your diary to go to that URL that I have there on the screen, www.sec.gov/info/edmanuals-vol2- keep putting in 27_D or numbers after that, and find out the moment they put the red line up. Keep tracking of all of these things on Twitter or other sources. That's the best we can do for you. Sometimes it seems like it's a fairly large surprise that they're making changes. They used to put out proposed rules related to the EDGAR Filer Manual. Now it goes right to a final rule, adopting it, and the Federal Register going up a few days later. All right, let's move on in our process. Step 7 is our calculation relationships. A key and foundational item, 615.2. If you've got 2 or more line items in the original HTML or ASCII that have a net or total at the end of the required context period, we'll be talking about context and the required context in just a minute, and the instance has numbers, then you have to have an effective calculation relationship from the total element to each of the contributing line items. So 615.2 is our foundation that says if there's a calculation relationship as described here, you need to have a calculation relationship captured and the relationship of child to parent. So 615.2, our key for calculations. Definitions. There is not as much as I might want to have in the EFM related to definitions. but 616 has the syntax and 617 has the contents. Most of those are automatable. Most of those are largely non-business directed, and most of those are beyond the business savvy of most of us. The EDGAR filer manual, the FAQs, interpretations do provide some guidance about the definition link base and when you should follow the definition link bases set up in the US GAAP taxonomy and when you might not need to. But not quite as much here as I might like in a more technical area. So that's the EFM related to the company extension taxonomy. In our remaining minutes here, let's talk about the instance document. We have our process flow, having done the prior steps where we can get our context ready. And again, a lot of software going to help you with these tasks. So we get our context together. We get our units of measure. We get ready to enter our facts into the system. Based on the presentation and the numbers, we assign appropriate decimal attributes to let it know how much it has been rounded. We create links to additional information, the information that you'll normally find on the bottom of a page with a number, a star, a superscript that points from a fact down to that text. Footnotes, not notes to the financial statement footnotes, but the more traditional literary footnotes. And finally, the validation process. I had mentioned the term required context, and this is something that's defined in 6.5.19. And so as we speak about context, a lot of things here in the EFM are going to be giving us guidance on the dates. And that's an important part of the context that you're going to provide in an instance. The right dates for facts is a topic of much ongoing discussion, and both the SEC in FAQs and observations and XBRL US in best practices, they will be providing and continue to consider additional guidance in this area. But the required context, we'll see a little bit more on that in the next slide. It is driven in some large part by the dates of the context. The required context is important for a number of things, in particular for the facts, the key facts that aren't found on the face of the financials or from the notes that are known as document and entity information. They drive the document itself. These items come from EFM 6.5.20 and 5.21. Many of these must be reported in the required context, that is according to the reporting period, that is with no dimensional qualification. So the required context are special context with the beginning and ending date of the reporting period, and things like the entity registration name and other very key things go to this context known as the required context. So driven 661, 662 with document and entity information required fields in 6.5.20, 6.5.21. What else might show up in a context? Well, dimensional information, and context store the dimensional qualifications like the ones we've spoken about when we talk about those key dimensional items about consolidated multiple entities, classes of stock and reporting scenarios. And so once again, the 6.6.3 through 6.6.11 are important things to consider as part of your context. Well, the dimensions will be going in there as well. And so let's move on. The units of measure. And monetary amounts probably dominate our mindset, if not the reports. And so standardized currencies are really important. And there's a reference to the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization Standard 4217. And that monetary items must be associated with ISO 4217 is required by the XBRL specification. But the appropriate currency codes, the ones you're allowed to use now, as well as a selection of certain other required units, is found in something called the Registry. This unit registry, the conformance with that since the 2012 taxonomy is laid out in EDGAR Filer Manual 6.5.35. all having to do with a new thing in the DEI called the UTR element. You can see it there. If the element UTR is in your standard name squared in the DTS of an, well, anyway, that's been happening since the 2012 taxonomy. And so 6535 now says that if you've got units of measure where the data types of the items are included in a unit registry, then you have to use the units laid out there. The unit registry sets out standards beyond currencies for the so-called SI, that's the International System of Units, units of measure, things like mass and length and time, but it didn't initially include business metrics like the number of stores or customers or lawsuits that are common in reports. These can and should be added in the future for greater automation and complementing. So now everybody wants to know about the facts, and step 3 means we're going to enter the facts appropriately into our tools. We're going to associate those with the primary element, and the EFM provides some good guidance here on what's going to be tagged on the face of the financials in the EFM 6612, 13, and 14. Now 6612 says that you're going to have facts for every combination of line item and period. So just to pull one out of the air here, if you got paid in capital, you're going to have a fact for every time period in the report that you report a value for paid in capital. Now 6613 says that you should use the same element for the same line item, even across periods, and so whatever element you choose for paid in capital for 2012 should be the same one you use for 2013, assuming that there's no change in the meaning. Now 6614 goes on to say that any amounts disclosed parenthetically, so that's numbers sitting in the captions in a line item, on a primary financial statement must have a corresponding fact value reported in that special thing set up for the parentheticals. Referring back to the financial statement here on the screen, all those highlighted items, so you've got the par value, you've got the number of shares, you've got all sorts of dollars and units and things. Those are going to require tagging either as part of the base statement or in a parenthetical to accompany it. The EFM includes guidance on the levels required for detailed note to the financial statement tagging, including level 1 tagging, the complete note and each required schedule. Level 2 tagging, the tagging of each significant accounting policy within the accounting policies note and beyond. Level 3 tagging, each thing that looks like a table with rows and columns within a note has to be tagged as text. And finally, that concepts must be assigned for each fact value, each amount, monetary amount, each percentage, each value in a note to the financial statement item, whether it's in the text, whether it's in a table. And if it's a required schedule, that's a level 2, but that's sort of being nitpicky. But these items 6, 16, 19, 20, 22, this is talking about the levels 1 through 4, and after June 15th, 2012, the rule 33.9002 says everybody's doing the detail, all the levels of tagging. The EFM also provides guidance on what not to include in instance documents. Include page numbers, don't include stuff that's not in the HTML. So everything that's there, but nothing that's not. When you put in your numbers, if there are words like 20,000, that's a number. Put it in as 20,000. If it is 20 expressed in thousands, enter it in as 20,000. If it says 1.7 expressed as millions, it's 1700000, no commas. There's no thousand separator. Use the period as the decimal point. So we make sure that these things are fully fleshed out, that we put the understood zeros back in, and we make sure that everything is appropriate for XML. And again, the tools help you with this most of the time. Something that may be a little bit more challenging is the decimals, because our goal step 4 is to assign decimal attributes to the fact value. And you'll find that guidance in 6632. So if we've got a fact of 14,528 expressed in thousands, I use 14528,000. We use -3 in the decimals, and again, a lot more goes on here of good guidance coming on. Finally, we're going to be getting that additional information that needs associated with the facts, the footnotes, the little thing where you've got a number or an asterisk or something pointing to information on the bottom of the page. If you've got information on the face financials, EFM 6639 and 40 say that we have to make sure they're appropriately entered as an XBRL footnote. EFM refers to them as linked footnotes so that they don't get confused with footnote as a term for the notes to the financial statement. It's all about those superscripty kind of things here. And look to 6639, 6640 for your guidance there. Oh, as we're coming down to the last minute or two here, even baking in quality is part of the EDGAR filer manual. The EFM Chapter 6 indicates that there's an assumption that filers will clear up validation errors using test submissions and only then use the previewer to evaluate rendering issues, such as the need to use negated labels to make the positive negatives value match. So as we've gone through our 50 items in 50 minutes, we've just touched on the guidance of the EDGAR filer manual. Tools such as those from the AICPA, who have published the principles and criteria for XBRL formatted information, and this, the Statement of Position 13.2 of agreed upon procedures on XBRL engagements. These can help point out other key EFM sections that may impact the business interpretation of your filings. And Michelle and the good crew may be talking to you about the XBRL US GAP certificate program, which will talk about these and other topics in much more detail. Well, Michelle, I can see I'm at the end of my 50 minutes, and I hand it back to you.
Eric, thanks very much. One other question for you, and again, for those of you listening, if you do have questions, please submit them through the moderated chat, which you see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. But another question for you, Eric, relates to other kinds of guidance. The FASB publishes something called implementation guides, and you know, one of the listeners was interested in how that factors into following the EFM guidelines. How should those be used?
Yes, certainly. I didn't mean to not say there's not a lot of other great materials out there to help you broadly with your filing. The XBRL US has got many webcasts that speak to very practical issues, and as the person said, the FASB, along with the taxonomy, provides style guides and other pieces of guidance. The FASB does not interpret the EDGAR filer manual, although they contribute to things like the XBRL US best practices guidance. And so their guidance does help in issues related to the taxonomy and in their understanding of the SEC's requirements, but it does not come in over the EDGAR filer manual in terms of authority. But absolutely, guidance from the FASB is really helpful in understanding how to better use the US GAAP taxonomy. You'll find should, I don't know, the IFRS taxonomy become adopted and supported by the EDGAR system in the not too distant future, that they'll have various documents that'll help you better understand the taxonomies. But again, they don't have jurisdiction over the rules. The EDGAR filer manual is called out by Rule 33.9002 to be the authoritative guidance for technical issues related to the filing.
Great, thank you. Eric, thanks very much. I just have one more question to everyone attending today. There are, we have other programs from XBRL US for education and training. We will have some in-person training coming up. The first one to take place is on June 12th in Orlando, Florida at the Renaissance Hotel. And it's our XBRL Essentials Workshop. And actually, Eric Cohen will be instructing at that program. So if you're interested in learning more about that event, just email us at info@xbrl.us for more information. We have another program coming up in September, which is taking place at the Hyatt Bellevue, Washington, outside Seattle. And that's our national conference. So that's a 2.5-day program. And again, you can find out more about that by emailing us at info@xbrl.us. The next point that you see here is the XBRL US Gap Certificate Program that Eric mentioned. This is an online training program that we developed jointly with the AICPA. It provides more than 40 CPE credit hours, and you can learn more about that by visiting xbrl.us/certificate. And finally, the XBRL Consistency Suite is a tool that allows you to run a set of over 15,000 rules against your instance document that check for issues like data quality errors. And some of these are errors that are pointed out in the EDGAR Filer Manual, or rules that come out of the EDGAR Filer Manual, but lots of other ones as well. They cover things like negative signage problems, positive signage problems, invalid combinations of concepts, calculation errors, and we've recently added roll forward problems as well. So check that out by visiting xbrl.us/csuite, CSUITE. Tomorrow we're going to email everyone with a link to the replay from the program, and also with some other offers and more information about educational programs from XBRL US. So thanks again for visiting with us today. Thanks again so much to Eric Cohen from PwC, and we'll have another program coming up next month. That one's going to be covering other comprehensive income. So you'll hear more about that in emails. Thanks very much.